The storm came in like a living thing, hissing around the eaves, clawing at the windows, stacking drifts against the old pine door until the latch groaned. Thomas Carter set another log on the fire and watched sparks lift like tiny stars, then die out mid-air. The radio had gone to static an hour ago. Power flickered, held, then flickered again. Out here in the Montana woods, silence wasn't just quiet. It was a presence that pressed against your ribcage and asked what you were made of. He was reaching for his mug when he heard it, so faint he almost mistook it for wind in the stovepipe. A high, needling cry, then another. He stood still. The porch shook as a gust shouldered the cabin. Cry, pause, cry. Not wind, not wood, life. He pulled on his winter coat, the one with a torn pocket he kept meaning to sew, and opened the door into a wall of white. Snow sifted in sideways. The cold hit his face like a slap. Thomas cupped a hand to his ear and listened. There, near the stack of split tamarack by the steps. He stepped down and went knee-deep immediately, boots gulped by powder. He waded toward the sound, breath burning in his chest. Wind keened through the firs. Beyond the tree line, nothing had edges, and the world tasted like iron. Two shapes huddled between the firewood and the rail, small, sodden, quivering. Kittens, he thought. Then his mind corrected itself. Not house cats. Spotted coats, tufted ears, marble blue eyes blown wide with fear. Bobcats, barely 3 or 4 months old by the look. One tried to hiss. The sound came out like a tiny broken kettle. The other pressed against it, ribs fluttering under matted fur. He swore softly. Instinct said, "Leave them." Another instinct, older, wired into his bones from a lifetime spent telling teenagers to try again, to be better than their worst day, said, "Pick them up." A third voice, practical, warned, "Where there are young, there is a mother." He looked over his shoulder. Blowing snow erased his tracks almost as quickly as he made them. The trees were a wall of gray and shadow. If she was out there, he couldn't see her. He could feel her, though. That same pressure in the ribs. "You little fools," he murmured, though he wasn't sure whether he meant them or himself. He slid his hands under their bellies. Both flinched but didn't fight. They were too cold to fight. One was all shiver, the other all limp. Their paws were like ice cubes against his palms. The cabin breathed heat when he shouldered the door. He kicked it shut, stamped snow off his boots, and lay the kittens in the open basket by the hearth, the one where kindling usually lived. He dumped the kindling onto the rug. Priorities. Wool blankets, he thought. Quick. He hauled 2 from the cedar chest, cut them into rough strips with kitchen scissors, and made small cocoons around each wild body. They trembled in their bundles like engines trying to turn over on a frozen morning. He heated milk and water on the stove, more water than milk, remembering a long-ago conversation with the vet who'd treated the Carter family's old calico. "Go slow," the vet had said. "Warm, drop by drop." Thomas found a clean eyedropper in the drawer he never cleaned out, the one that caught everything. Paper clips, stray screws, a dried wishbone from a Thanksgiving he hadn't wanted to end. He knelt beside the basket and paw, with hands that remembered cradling a feverish toddler at 3 a.m., tipped warmth onto 2 tiny tongues. One kitten swallowed, then swallowed again, a beat steadier. The other winced, as if the act of living hurt, then blinked and latched onto the idea that life might be possible after all. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He reached to feed the first again, and without warning, felt it hook a needle-thin claw into the wool at his wrist. Not a threat, an anchor. The fire cracked, popped resin, threw light that made the cabin glow like a lantern left on the floor of a church. Wind roared, then, for a small, merciful minute, fell away. In the hush, Thomas heard the peculiar sound of trust forming, the gentle, uncertain purr of a creature that didn't yet have a reason to trust him, making one up anyway. He looked toward the door. The latch held. Snow rasped across the pane. Between one heartbeat and the next, he imagined a larger shadow moving out there, pacing the line where his world ended and hers began. He could almost hear his late wife's voice. "You always bring home strays, Tom." He almost answered out loud, "Just keeping the balance, Em." Would you have done the same? Opened your door to the wild in the middle of a blizzard? Where are you watching from? If you've ever taken a chance on a fragile life, I'd love to hear your city, your town, your road at the edge of nowhere. The kitten's shivers softened. One tucked its nose under its sibling's chin. The other dreamed a small, twitching dream and bumped the edge of the basket with a paw. Thomas eased himself into the rocking chair and let its old rhythm find him. He hung the torn coat by the stove to steam, breathed in the mingled smells of wet wool, wood smoke, and pine sap, and felt something like a pulse pass between the four of them. Man, fire, storm, wild. On the side table lay his worn leather journal, a stub of pencil balanced in its spine. He drew it closer, flipped to a clean page, and wrote, "Found 2 bobcat kittens on the porch, near frozen. Brought them in. If there's a mother, she'll come." The light dimmed as clouds shouldered the mountains. The room took on that blue hour that compresses time and thought. Thomas shut the journal and listened with his whole body. Snow sighed against the door. Beneath that, the kitten's faint breath. Beneath that, the patient ticking of the old mantel clock. Somewhere behind the sound of his own heart, a question hovered, one he couldn't answer yet, one the storm itself seemed to be asking. He placed the journal back on the table, then settled deeper into the chair, a wool blanket across his lap and 2 small lives at his feet. Outside, the world erased and rewrote itself in white. Inside, the circle began with a single, stubborn act. He had chosen to give. The night stretched long, punctuated by the hiss of logs and the restless twitch of the kittens in their wool cocoons. Thomas dozed in the rocker, waking at each sudden crack of the fire. Around midnight he rose, eased stiff knees, and peeked out through the frosted glass. Darkness was thick, but movement. Yes, there, just beyond the tree line, a shape too deliberate to be wind. The mother. A jolt of instinct ran through him. If she'd tracked them here, she would not forgive easily. He stepped back, pulse quickening. For a long moment he stood in the dim cabin, staring at the latch, at the way the door seemed suddenly flimsy against the raw will of the wild. The kittens stirred at the same time, one mewling softly, the other pawing at the edge of the basket. They knew. The mother's cry came then, muffled by snow but sharp enough to cut through the walls, a sound of command, a sound that belonged to forests and ridgelines, not 4 cramped walls and a hearth. The kittens answered with faint squeaks. Thomas pressed his hand to the doorframe. Should he open it? Should he give them back? But outside was deathly cold. He imagined their tiny bodies stiffening in the drift before dawn. And maybe, just maybe, he was already too late to return them. The mother might not take them now, but his scent clung to their fur. Hours passed. The shadow at the trees withdrew, reappeared, withdrew again, pacing. Thomas felt like a trespasser in his own home, caught between two loyalties, the law of the wild and the law of compassion. By morning, light seeped through thin curtains. The storm had blown itself hollow, leaving a silence that rang in the ears. He ventured outside. Snow was knee-high, bright enough to hurt his eyes. Across the yard, just at the edge of the forest, paw prints carved a restless circle. Large prints, fresh, watching him. He tightened his scarf and looked back at the cabin, where smoke drifted from the chimney like a fragile thread. Inside were two fragile lives that had tethered themselves to him in less than a night. Outside was their blood, their mother, the rightful keeper. That tension would not resolve easily. When he stepped back in, both kittens were awake, one batting weakly at the fringe of the blanket, the other gazing with unblinking eyes into the flames. He crouched and touched a tentative ear, warm now, not icy, alive. For the first time in years, Thomas whispered a prayer without realizing it. Let me do right, whatever right is. And as he whispered, a knock rattled the cabin wall. Not from a fist, but from outside, heavy and deliberate, as if something massive had brushed the siding. The mother was closer than he thought. He froze, one hand hovering over the kittens. The air thickened with decision. Would he hold on to them, or open the door? The fire snapped. The kittens shifted. The question remained, and the mother's shadow lingered. By the third day, the blizzard had passed, but the aftermath clung like a bruise. Branches snapped under the weight of snow. And the trail into town was half buried, a treacherous snake of ice. Thomas wrapped the kittens into a wooden crate lined with old flannel and carried them to the truck. He needed supplies, formula, medicine, maybe advice from Doc Hensley, the vet who owed him a favor from years back. The drive was slow, tires groaning through slush. The kittens mewed faintly at every bump, their small voices swallowed by the hum of the engine. By the time he rolled into Pine Hollow, the town square looked ghostly. Snow piled against storefronts, icicles like teeth overhanging the diner's awning. Inside the general store, warmth and suspicion hit at once. Folks noticed. "Morning, Tom," called Clara, the store clerk, though her eyes dropped to the crate in his arms. A murmur rippled through the two other customers. A man in a hunting jacket stepped closer. "What you got there?" "Found 'em near the cabin," Thomas answered evenly, setting the crate gently on the counter. Tiny ears flicked. One kitten sneezed, drawing a collective intake of breath. "Near frozen. Couldn't leave them." The hunter frowned. "Bobcats. You know what folks'll say. Dangerous. Carrying who knows what disease. Best to let nature do its work." Thomas felt every eye. The kittens stirred as though sensing the sudden wall of judgment. He thought of their frail paws warming against his wrist that first night, the sound of a shaky purr choosing trust. Clara leaned closer. "They look half dead, Tom. Maybe you ought to hand them to animal control." The phrase landed like a stone in his gut. He imagined the sterile cages, the quick decisions made with forms and signatures. He didn't trust bureaucracy with fragile things. Not after what he'd seen in his years teaching kids who slipped through cracks because rules were easier than compassion. I'll take care of them, he said firmly, collecting formula powder and dropper bottles from the shelf. His tone brooked no debate, but debate came anyway. You're asking for trouble, the hunter muttered. What happens when the mother comes around? Or when those kittens grow teeth big enough to test that kindness of yours? Thomas's jaw tightened. Then I'll deal with it. He paid, gathered the supplies, and left under a sky too bright for all the suspicion hanging heavy in his chest. Outside, the cold bit deep, sharper than inside the store. As he opened the truck door, he caught sight of Sheriff Lang leaning against his cruiser, arms crossed. "Morning, Carter," the sheriff drawled. His gaze fell to the crate. "Heard you're keeping some wild company." Thomas bristled. "Just making sure they survive the week." Lang tilted his hat back. "You know the law, Tom. State frowns on harboring wild predators, even babies." He paused, letting the warning hang. "Don't make me get calls about you." It was no threat, not exactly. But Thomas heard the undertone. One wrong step, and the kittens might be seized, their fate sealed by red tape. He lifted the crate into the cab, heart pounding harder than the engine would when it finally turned. Back at the cabin, the forest loomed taller, darker. Tracks circled near the tree line again, bigger, deeper. The mother hadn't given up. She was waiting, watching. Inside, as he fed the kittens drop by drop, Thomas felt the weight of two worlds pressing on him. The human one, suspicious and bound by rules, and the wild one, patient and relentless, demanding its own law be respected. He sat between them, an old man with a stubborn streak and two fragile lives that should never have been his responsibility. Yet here they were. That night, as the wind rattled loose shutters, Thomas wrote in his journal, "Neighbors doubt. Sheriff warns. Mother waits. But the kittens breathe easier tonight. Their eyes meet mine. I don't know whose side that puts me on anymore." And as he set down the pencil, a sound rose from the edge of the woods, a deeper, sharper cry than before, vibrating through the snowdrifts like a warning. The question pressed harder than ever. Was he saving these kittens or stealing them? The fourth night carried a different kind of silence, one that made Thomas wake with his skin prickling before he knew why. The fire had burned low, casting only a red heartbeat of light across the floor. The kittens, curled tight in their crate, twitched in uneasy sleep. Then he heard it, a low, dragging scrape against the siding, slow as breath. He rose, muscles stiff, and eased to the window. The glass was frosted, but beyond it the yard glowed under moonlight. At first, nothing. Then a shape materialized. Broad shoulders, tufted ears, a tail like a whip cutting through the snow. The mother bobcat, closer than ever, circling the cabin with the patience of hunger and fury. The kittens stirred, emitting soft, confused cries. The mother stopped beneath the window. Her eyes caught the moon and burned pale green. The air in the room tightened, and Thomas felt, absurdly, like she was staring not at the kittens, but at him. Judging, demanding. Suddenly, crack! Something snapped outside, sharp as a gunshot. A branch fell from the weight of ice, slamming into the porch railing. The mother bolted into the trees, vanishing as though she had never been. But the message was left behind. She knew where her young were. Morning came brittle and bright. Thomas shoveled a narrow path through waist-high drifts, sweat freezing on his collar. Near the tree line, he found what set his stomach on edge. claw marks gouged into the bark of a spruce, higher than his shoulder. A mark of territory. A warning. He bent close, tracing the grooves with a gloved hand. The forest was too quiet. Not a bird call, not a rustle. Only the distant crackle of ice breaking in the thaw. He felt watched. Back at the cabin, he found the kittens more restless, mewing with sharper voices. They were stronger now, and one even batted at his sleeve with claws that no longer trembled. That should have cheered him. But instead, he saw the trajectory, the law of wild things pulling them away from him, toward teeth and instinct. As dusk bled across the snow, headlights cut through the trees. A truck pulled up, Sheriff Lang again. He stepped onto the porch, stamping snow off his boots. "Evening, Tom," he said, tone neutral. "Had reports of a big cat stalking near the school bus route. Folks are nervous. Thought I'd check if you've noticed anything." Thomas stiffened. "Tracks near my tree line. Nothing more." Lang's gaze swept to the crate inside. "Those kittens. You sure you know what you're doing? Animals like that don't just adjust. And their mother won't quit. You're stirring a pot that could boil over." The sheriff left the warning hanging in the cold air. Then he tipped his hat and trudged back to the truck. Tires crunched, lights vanished, leaving Thomas alone again with the kittens and the echo of Lang's words. That night, Thomas sat by the fire with his journal open, but couldn't write. Every creak of the cabin boards made him glance toward the door. Every flicker of flame seemed to sketch the mother's shadow on the wall. He whispered into the hush, "I'm not your enemy." But the silence didn't answer. Only the kittens, pressing close together, breathing in rhythm, as if bracing for what was coming. And deep in the woods, a cry rose again, longer this time, almost triumphant. What would you do if the wild itself came to reclaim what you saved? Would you surrender or fight to protect? Share your thoughts below, and if this story keeps you on edge, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The following morning broke in shards of blue light, brittle as glass. Thomas had barely slept, his mind chasing the memory of that cry in the night. He fed the kittens carefully, watching their tiny jaws work the dropper, then carried the empty bottle to the sink. That's when he heard it. Another sound, but closer than ever. A shuffle, a thud, snow collapsing outside the cabin wall. His pulse spiked. He grabbed the old rifle from its rack. Not to shoot, he told himself, but to have in his hands. He crept to the window. The mother bobcat was on the porch. Her body was all muscle under the winter coat, her tail twitching with restless fury. She sniffed the doorframe, ears erect, then pressed her nose to the crack beneath the wood. The kittens inside whined in recognition, their small voices piercing through the air. The mother's ears swiveled, and her paw, broad, lethal, scratched once at the door as if testing how thin the barrier was. Thomas froze, every muscle strung taut. He pictured the latch splintering, her bursting in, the kittens rushing toward her, him caught between. What would he do? Fire the rifle? No, he couldn't. But could he stand by if she harmed them in her desperation? Then the mother gave a low, guttural growl, a sound that sank to his bones. The kittens went silent, huddling deeper in the crate. For a long second, predator and man were locked in a stillness so sharp, it seemed the whole forest held its breath. And then, crash. The wind shoved a half-loose shutter off its hinge. It slammed against the siding with a report like thunder. The mother flinched, spun, and vanished from the porch in a single bound, her shape swallowed by pines heavy with snow. Thomas stood there trembling, breath ragged. He lowered the rifle. His heart took minutes to slow. He glanced at the kittens. They were staring at the door, eyes wide, ears flat. They hadn't purred since last night. That day he worked to reinforce the cabin, bar across the door, shutters nailed tight, wood stacked against the walls. Each hammer strike echoed too loud in the cold air, and every echo reminded him he was bracing against nature itself. By evening, the fire cast long shadows across the room. The kittens crept from their crate and curled in his lap, still wary, but seeking his warmth. He stroked their fur slowly, feeling the thrum of their fragile trust. Yet he couldn't shake the truth. He was living on borrowed time. Sooner or later, the mother would come again. Smarter, bolder, maybe angrier, and he would have to choose whether to let her reclaim them or risk everything to keep them alive. Outside, snow began to fall again, muffling the forest. The world grew quiet, but Thomas knew silence was only the prelude. The storm was not over. It was just changing shape. By the end of the week, word had spread further than Thomas wanted. At the diner in Pine Hollow, voices dropped when he walked in, and conversations started again only when the door shut behind him. He could feel it. Eyes on his back, suspicion in the air thicker than the steam rising off the coffee pots. Clara, the store clerk, leaned over the counter when he came to buy more milk powder. "Tom, folks are talking," she said. Voice hushed. "Some say you're raising predators. Others think you're putting us all in danger." He kept his jaw steady. "They're just kittens. Weak ones at that." But Clara didn't look convinced. "Weak or not, they won't stay that way. And if the mother's prowling near town, well, parents are already worried." As if on cue, the doorbell chimed and 2 hunters stepped in, stamping snow off their boots. They glanced at Thomas, then at each other. One muttered just loud enough, "Should have left them to freeze." The other chuckled darkly. Thomas gathered his supplies and left without a word, but the tension followed him down Main Street. Sheriff Lang's cruiser idled by the post office. The sheriff rolled down his window. "Tom," he called, "mind if we talk?" Thomas stopped, the crate of supplies heavy in his hands. "If this is about the kittens," Lang cut him off, "it's about the community. People are nervous. You're drawing lines, and not the kind you can erase." For a moment, Thomas saw the younger man he once knew in Lang, a boy who'd played baseball with his son before tragedy split their lives apart. Now here he was, a lawman caught between duty and memory. "I'm not looking for trouble," Thomas said quietly. Lang's gaze hardened. "Trouble has a way of finding you when you shelter it." The drive back to the cabin felt longer than usual. Snowfields gleamed beneath a pale sun, beautiful and unforgiving. When he arrived, the kittens greeted him with eager cries. They were stronger now, climbing awkwardly out of their crate, batting at his boots, their wildness glinting brighter with each passing day. Yet their trust in him hadn't faded. One pawed his hand until he let it crawl into his palm, its tiny claws pricking his skin without malice. The other followed, curling at his feet, as though he were both den and shield. He sank into the rocker and stared at the fire. The town wanted him to let go. The sheriff wanted him to reconsider. The forest wanted its young back. But the kittens, they only wanted him. That night, as the wind rattled the cabin roof, he opened his journal and wrote, The world is splitting at the seams. Neighbors whisper. The mother circles closer. Yet inside there's only warmth and two small lives trusting me more than I deserve. He closed the book and sat listening, the fire crackling. In the distance, faint but undeniable, the cry of the mother carried again through the trees, longer, sharper, closer. The seventh night was the one Thomas would remember for the rest of his days. The storm clouds had rolled back in, heavy and low, muffling the forest in gray silence. He sat by the fire with the kittens nestled against his boots when a noise snapped him alert. A sharp thud against the porch, followed by the creak of wood under weight. He stood slowly, rifle in hand, and stepped to the window. There she was. The mother bobcat crouched on the porch, muscles rippling beneath her coat, eyes lit like coals in the lantern glow. She was larger than he remembered, her breath misting in heavy bursts. She stared at the door, then at the thin seam of light leaking from the cabin window. The kittens sensed her before Thomas even moved. They cried in a high, urgent pitch, half longing, half fear. The mother answered with a guttural yowl that rattled the panes. The sound wasn't just a call, it was a claim. Thomas's heart pounded. He pressed his palm against the door as if to hold it shut, but he knew wood and nails were no match if she decided to break through. His grip on the rifle tightened, though the thought of pulling the trigger made his stomach twist. The mother rose onto her haunches and swiped the door once, hard. The latch shuddered, the wood groaned. The kittens went silent, crouching low in their crate. Thomas felt the moment stretching thin, like glass ready to splinter. "Not yet," he muttered, voice breaking in the quiet. "Not like this." Then, headlights. Twin beams cut through the snow and swept across the yard. A truck skidded to a stop at the tree line. Sheriff Lang leapt out, shotgun slung across his chest. "Carter!" he shouted. "Step away from the door!" The mother froze, ears flat, eyes snapping to the intrusion. She gave one last bone-deep growl, then bounded off the porch and melted into the trees. Snow sprayed behind her like sparks. Lang stomped up the steps, breath clouding in the cold. "You see that? She's bold now. She'll come again. And next time, Tom, you won't scare her off." Thomas lowered the rifle, but said nothing. The kittens trembled, their tiny bodies pressed together, eyes wide in the firelight. Lang scanned the room, his gaze settling on the crate. "This ends tonight. Those kittens go to animal control in the morning." The words struck harder than the bobcat's swipe. Thomas swallowed, torn between relief that someone else would shoulder the danger and dread at what that fate meant for the kittens. "They won't survive in a cage," he said hoarsely. Lang's jaw tightened. "They won't survive here either, and neither will you if their mother tears down these walls." The sheriff left as quickly as he'd arrived, tires spitting snow as the truck disappeared into the storm. Silence returned, but it was heavier now, full of choices Thomas didn't want to make. He sank into the rocker, head in his hands. The kittens crept toward him, one paw resting on his boot as if to anchor him. The fire crackled. Outside, the forest waited, and Thomas knew the standoff wasn't over. It had only begun. What would you do if law and wild both closed in on your doorstep? Who would you defy? Comment below, and if this standoff keeps you hooked, like and subscribe to see what Thomas chooses next. Dawn came dim, the sky smudged with gray. Thomas hadn't slept. He sat in the rocker all night, rifle leaning against the wall, the kittens curled close against his legs. Every creak of the roof made him flinch. Every gust of wind felt like the mother's breath pressing against the cabin. And now, the sheriff's words echoed louder than the storm. Animal control in the morning. He fed the kittens slowly, watching the way their eyes lit with life that hadn't been there days ago. One swatted playfully at the dropper. The other pawed clumsily at his sleeve. They were fragile, yes, but no longer fading. And with that came the truth. He could no longer pretend they were his to keep. A knock at the door. Hard, deliberate. Thomas stiffened. He half expected the mother again, but when he opened the door, it was Sheriff Lang, hat pulled low, face carved with exhaustion. "You ready?" Lang asked, glancing at the crate by the fire. Thomas hesitated. "Lang, if they go into a cage, they won't come back out." "They'll die here," Lang shot back, "and maybe take you with them, or worse, someone else. You're not just one man on a mountain, Tom. You're part of a town. That comes with weight." The words cut deep. Thomas thought of the whispers in the diner, the children walking bus routes lined with snow, the uneasy looks of neighbors. And he thought, too, of his late wife's voice, always telling him, doing good means taking the harder road. He closed the door without answering. For hours he wrestled with it. Letting them go felt like betrayal. Keeping them felt like a death sentence. For himself, for them. Maybe even for the mother, who wouldn't stop until something gave. By afternoon, he had made his decision. He bundled the kittens in the same wool strips he'd used that first night and placed them back into the crate. Their eyes blinked up at him, uncomprehending but trusting. His chest ached under the weight of that trust. Lang waited outside, engine running. Thomas stepped onto the porch, crate in his arms. But halfway to the truck, a sound split the air, sharp, commanding. The mother. She stood at the tree line, fur bristling, muscles coiled, her eyes locked on him, then the crate. The kittens stirred, mewing desperately. The bond between them vibrated through the frozen air. Lang cursed, hand flying to his shotgun. "Back, Tom! Get back!" Thomas froze in the snow, caught between two forces, law on one side, wild on the other. His hands tightened on the crate. He could feel the kittens pressing against the wood, answering their mother's call. In that moment, the decision wasn't about rules or even safety. It was about what he could live with. Slowly, he lowered the crate to the ground. Lang barked his name, but Thomas barely heard him. The mother stepped forward, one careful stride at a time, her growl low, vibrating the earth. Thomas stood very still, breath clouding in the cold. His heart hammered as he waited to see what choice the wild itself would make. The air was so still Thomas could hear the kittens' tiny claws scraping the crate, desperate to answer their mother's call. Sheriff Lang's voice cut through the silence, sharp, urgent. "Tom, don't do this! Step away!" But Thomas didn't move. His boots sank deeper into the snow as he crouched and slid the crate a few inches forward. The mother bobcat froze, her breath rising in thick clouds, her muscles trembling with restraint. She was close enough now that Thomas could see a thin scar across her muzzle, proof she had fought for survival long before this night. "Easy," Thomas whispered, though he wasn't sure if he spoke to her, to the kittens, or to himself. Lang's shotgun cocked behind him. "One wrong step and she's on you." "Put it down, Lang," Thomas said firmly. His voice shook, but the resolve in it was unmistakable. "If you fire, you'll kill more than her. You'll kill the trust in this." He gestured to the crate between them. The mother edged closer, her paws silent over the snow. The kittens mewed again, louder this time, and the sound broke whatever barrier held her back. With a sudden grace, she closed the distance and pressed her nose to the slats of the crate. The kittens reached through with their paws, brushing her muzzle. A rumble of deep, guttural sound rolled from her chest. Recognition. Relief. Possession. Thomas's throat tightened. He unlatched the crate slowly, inch by inch. His breath fogged the air, his hands trembling. The door creaked open, and in a blur of fur and claws, the kittens tumbled into the snow. They bounded clumsily toward her, their mews turning sharp with joy. She bent low, curling her body around them, licking their fur with frantic urgency. For a long moment, it was only them, the reunion raw and fierce, the kind that left no doubt who belonged to whom. Lang swore under his breath. "Tom, you're out of your mind." "Maybe," Thomas said softly, his chest aching with both loss and awe. "But some things aren't ours to keep." The mother bobcat lifted her head, eyes fixing on him. It wasn't gratitude. Not exactly. It was something older, more primal, a recognition of the choice he had made. She held his gaze for a long, searing heartbeat before nudging her young toward the trees. The kittens hesitated, one glancing back at Thomas, ears flicking as though torn. Then, with a final mew, they disappeared into the pines, swallowed by shadow. The forest closed around them, silent once more. Thomas stood rooted, snow numbing his hands, the crate empty at his feet. A hollowness spread through him, equal parts grief and release. Behind him, Lang lowered the shotgun, shaking his head. "You just let your heart write a death sentence," the sheriff muttered. "Or maybe a life," Thomas answered. His voice was raw but steady. The two men stood in silence, the cabin light glowing behind them, the wild pressing in all around. For the first time in days, Thomas felt the air ease in his chest. The circle wasn't closed yet. But it had begun. The cabin felt impossibly quiet after they were gone. No faint mews, no tiny paws pattering across the floorboards. Only the pop of the fire and the tick of the mantel clock. Thomas sat in his rocker, staring at the empty crate, the wool blankets still carrying the faint warmth of the kittens. For the first time in a long while, he felt both heavy and light, as if loss and peace had braided together. Outside, the storm clouds drifted away, revealing a sky bruised with sunrise. Snow sparkled along the tree line, and for a moment, Thomas thought he saw movement, a sleek shape vanishing into the woods, two smaller shadows close at her side. He closed his eyes. The bond was unbroken, only returned to where it belonged. Sheriff Lang lingered on the porch, arms crossed, eyes distant. Finally he spoke. "You know, Tom, people won't understand what you did. They'll think you caved, or that you risked the town for nothing." Thomas rose slowly, his knees creaking, and opened the door wider to let the cold air rush in. "Maybe they don't have to understand," he said. "Sometimes the right thing isn't safe. Sometimes it just has to be done." Lang studied him, then gave a reluctant nod. "Reckon you'll always do things your way." With that, he trudged back to his truck, leaving Thomas alone once more. The day passed quietly. Thomas gathered the scattered blankets, mended the torn pocket on his winter coat, and stacked the last of the firewood. The cabin felt older now, but steadier, like it had absorbed the weight of what had happened. By evening, he lit the lantern and opened his journal. The pencil hovered, then scratched across the page. "Gave them back today. not mine to keep. But they lived, and maybe that's enough. He closed the book and sat back, listening to the hush that filled the woods. It was not emptiness. It was balance. As he drifted toward sleep in the rocker, he dreamed, not of storms or arguments, but of two small shapes bounding through snowdrifts under their mother's watchful gaze. And in the dream, he stood on the porch, smiling, knowing he had given and received in equal measure. When he woke at dawn, a gift waited just beyond the steps. In the snow lay the clean, perfect skull of a deer, left as if the forest itself had chosen to honor his choice. Thomas bent, lifted it carefully, and set it on the mantel beside the clock. A reminder, not of death, but of respect. The circle had closed. He had given, he had received, and now he understood balance. He stoked the fire, sat again in the rocker, and let the quiet stretch. Outside, the world was still winter, but spring was already written in the air. And Thomas, for the first time in years, felt ready to meet it. Sometimes letting go is the only way to keep the story whole. Have you ever released something you loved, only to find peace waiting on the other side? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to read it. And if this tale moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of courage, heartbreak, and hope.